Okay. So I just want to start by thanking everybody for joining us today and over the weekend, and for not only for sharing your work in this symposium, but also for your work's contribution to our overall better understanding of sport and physical activity in our lives, an activity that we surely all love. Just a quick note as well on the purpose/goal of the symposium. And it's essentially in our earliest planning stages, our goal was from the beginning to serve our mandate of offering a platform for emerging scholars as well as established to disseminate their work to as wide an audience as possible at little or no cost to the author, or in this case to the presenter. And to this end, we have sought to make this symposium as accessible as possible, particularly through social media. We've collected questions via Twitter and email. Your presentations are available for all to see on the website. You can, and many of you have sent people over there, and there's that we track the traffic to the website, and we've been quite impressed with the amount of clicks and people watching your amazing work. Next, just a few brief thank yous to certain people who've made this possible. First to Darren Curry from Land to Sky Photography. He's responsible for a lot of the images that we use on the website and for the symposium. To Dr. Allison Doherty from the Sport and Social Impact Research Group at Western University in London, Ontario. We want to thank her both for her promotion of the symposium via Twitter and other platforms, but also her guidance to make the symposium better, particularly in the early stages of the organization of the symposium. To Kajil Eriksson from Idrots Forum. He's been basically our point man in Europe and online promotion to certain calls for papers, calls for presentations, things like that. To Brittany Reed, who's also presenting here at the symposium today. She's been an invaluable contributor to the success of just the journal in particular, but also a great help for the organization of this symposium, and we just wanted to thank her as well. And as well to Brenda Smith from Digital Commons at TRU University in British Columbia. She's the one responsible for getting us indexed via Google Scholar. So we just wanted to take this opportunity to thank her publicly for that. And finally, to our distinguished speakers, Melissa Otterbein from USA Triathlon and her two co-presenters, Cindy Miller-Aron and Paul Grzinski. Melissa and I met a little over a year ago at a conference in Toronto, and since then Melissa has been an invaluable contributor to the success of Jess, and we are very excited to have her share with us her work on athlete mental health at USA Triathlon this afternoon. And then tomorrow's distinguished speaker, Sam McKegney and Robert Henry from the IHRN, the Indigenous Hockey Research Network. Sam has been a significant supporter of the journal from the beginning, and we are very grateful to have him and other members of the IHRN share a very interesting and important piece on the Beardy's Hockey Organization in Saskatchewan tomorrow for that. And finally, to Janice Forsyth, who is one of, if not our biggest supporters, who we cannot thank enough. And we are very excited to have a live Q&A with her. It will be live about her recent publication of her book, Reclaiming Tom Longboat. And with that, we will segue into our first session titled Inclusion, Difference, and Gender. When organizing this symposium and putting sessions together, what we really liked about the way this session kind of shaped up was how it covers research pertaining to issues of gender stereotypes and gendered inclusion in various aspects of sport throughout a lifetime. Allison's work details young adolescents and young girls. Emily Johnson's and Ashley Ryder's dealt with adulthood, women in sport and various segments of the sporting world. And then Rebecca's, your research deals with issues pertaining to women at an older age. And this speaks to the fact that these issues are relevant to us all, regardless of the time in our lives in which we experience and participate in sport. And just for just a quick note that due to unforeseen events, Emily Johnson and Ashley Ryder were regrettably not able to be here today for this session. But they welcome any questions either via email or through social media. We can give you contact information if you had a question for them and wish to get their response to it. And with that, I'm gonna send this over to our presenters and give them a chance to introduce themselves and briefly describe their work, their presentation, before we get into the conversations. We will start with Allison Grace.
Okay.
Allison.
Sure. So I'm Allison Grace, and I'm currently a third-year student at Springfield College in Springfield, Massachusetts, working towards my doctorate in physical education with a specialization in sport and exercise psychology. So my project was related to diminishing gender role stereotyping in elementary school aged girls. And this stemmed from my motor development class. We had to do a culminating project where we developed some sort of deliverable targeting either a current issue within the field of motor development or an area of interest. And using my background and interest in sports psychology, I wanted to kind of combine the motor development side with the sports psychology side. So I knew with respect to gender role stereotyping, how do we combat that and promote age-appropriate sport-related skills and fundamental movement skills for elementary school-aged girls. So I created the posters with female role models depicting the sport-related skill, and they were either female grown adult women role models or age-matched peers. So in addition to the posters, I created a supplemental review of literature, but it kind of talked about how prior to about puberty, the age-related differences in sport-related skills are largely environmentally based. So it's influenced heavily by the media, significant others like peers, parents, coaches, teachers. And we know that that has implications for motivation, self-efficacy, and participation across the lifespan. So the goal of the posters would be that they were displayed in elementary schools, and specifically where the students would have their physical education classes, so the young girls could see role models in these non-traditional female sports. And then, you know, obviously related back to self-efficacy and Brindora, seeing similar others model the skills can kind of reinforce that, hey, you know, here's somebody who's very similar to me participating. This is something I can do too, and maybe discover a new sport, a new interest, and, you know, continued involvement throughout their lifespan.
That's fantastic. Okay, and Becky, you can go next.
Okay, hi, yes, so my name is Becky Oatley. I'm a PhD student at the Association for Dementia Studies at the University of Worcester here in the UK. I'm just entering into my fourth year, so I'm kind of at the stage where I'm trying to write everything up. So I'm very grateful actually to the Journal of Emerging Sports Studies in providing me an opportunity to do something other than write. So my study is a qualitative ethnographic style study of women's experiences of sport reminiscence groups for people living with dementia. So these are kind of groups that people living with dementia or their care partners, family members go to in the community. So it could be at a sports club, a library, perhaps a community centre, under the guise of doing some sort of activity related to recalling sport-related memories. That might be very kind of specific around a club, could be specific around a particular sport, or it could just be a very just general sport interest group. And what I found at the start was that sport reminiscence is very much advocated as an activity to attract men living with dementia. But as yet, there are no female voices in the literature at all. So my study is the first one to actually talk to the women involved in these groups. Now, what I found was that obviously sport reminiscence is very much dominated by very kind of limited gender stereotypes that really kind of accentuate those sorts of binary ideas of what it means to be an older man or an older woman. And these are very unhelpful to a lot of women, but also a lot of men. And it can really affect kind of your opportunity to both access the activities and benefit from them. I also found that practice was very limited in terms of, there was a great emphasis on kind of verbal discussion and factual recall, which could be quite exclusive to a lot of people living with dementia. They just couldn't access those kind of activities because of their particular symptoms. But what I did find was from the individual women involved in my study was actually sport reminiscence has the potential to be a really meaningful activity for all sorts of different people. And sport has a real kind of benefit in being a location that's maybe a bit removed from the stigma that other older people's services or dementia related services sometimes are kind of tainted with. And also, I guess what was really interesting to me was that some of these older women, sport was actually a domain that, although they were very aware of and affected by these quite dominant stereotypes, this was a location that had provided them opportunity to challenge those stereotypes in their kind of lifetime experiences. And maybe an opportunity for maybe slightly, varied gender expression. I guess overall, my kind of research is kind of saying that we need to take a much more critical approach to sport reminiscence and really recognise the impact that gender, but also other kind of categories of sociocultural difference have on that kind of access and impact of the sport environment. And these kind of things are really important for people living with dementia to understand how those kind of, how we can make interventions as effective as possible. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I guess now we can open it up to questions. If anybody has a question, you can wave or let me know via the chat function or the participant function. If not, I have questions prepared. I see.
Trying to.
Hi, Kevin.
Yes, I'm lurking in the background, guys. I'm working on that first cup of coffee. But I wanted to just sort of come out and support everybody and participate in the conference. I'm out of my depth in this panel. You guys are working on things I'm not really that familiar with, but I did want to just ask Becky, I actually sort of live out here in small town South Carolina. I'm not too far from Clemson University, and I just wondered if you had heard about their program there. It strikes me as similar to some of the things you're working on, and if you hadn't, I could try to make some connections there, but if you have, you could sort of pitch in on that. You're probably more familiar with it than I am.
Well, I have heard of it. So I think Hawkins wrote or published a paper this year. That's how I came across it. And that's really interesting because that, like quite a lot of the literature, comes out with some real sort of good advice around best practice, which with people living with dementia is often around that kind of preparation and personalizing stuff. So you really understand what's important to them and then kind of tailor the intervention around it. But what I found in practice is that often those best practice things from research aren't translating. So it seems like in practice, actually, we just want to get as many people through the door as possible to say, look how many people we're helping. And actually, that's the kind of polar opposite of what we need to do with people living with dementia. So yeah, I have heard of it. There's some really interesting stuff going on there.
And is the idea there that sport becomes something that's kind of so just hardwired into our identity and existence that as dementia sets in, you can still draw on those sporting experiences, you know, that they kind of linger? That was I've just sort of read about the Clemson project a couple of different times, and my sense was, you know, there are a lot of people out there, in particular around Clemson, that have these connections with the football team, especially, that just are baked into their identity, you know?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That's the kind of rationale, is that there are lots of people who can be drawn together by a single sort of big club or something like that. So similar projects in Scotland around some of the big football clubs here. The only sort of critique I have of that approach is that there are some people for whom it's really important, and it becomes a really important part of their identity. But although sport is kind of almost universal and pervasive in our culture, we all have really different levels of meaning attached to it. So there are some people who, you know, are sort of self-ascribed hardcore fans for whom that will be a really important thing. But then there's a lot of people who, yeah, they might take some interest in it, but it's not a hardwired part of their identity. And I think we can sometimes be guilty in sport, and I'm a kind of self-ascribed lover of sport myself, of assuming that it means as much to everyone as it does to me. I think that's certainly in dementia care, because sport reminiscence is a relatively new thing. It can be quite shiny, it can be attached to sort of quite famous clubs and players. We can be guilty of thinking that it's much greater and much more impactful than it necessarily is.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Sorry, is there any other questions there? Anybody else? Okay, I have a question for Allison, actually. So one of the stereotypes that you mentioned in your presentation is the gender divisions of the types of sports that girls and boys play. And I noticed in your examples of your posters that a lot of the visual focus in the posters was on individual female athletes. And I was wondering, have you considered, or are there other posters that have girl athletes or women athletes who are a part of a team, in a part of a team environment, and even potentially a part of like a mixed team environment of both boys and girls, and how would that affect these stereotypes in the way that you're investigating them?
Thank you. So one of the limitations of how this project worked was there was a learning objective that we had to use ethical technology. So we used the Creative Commons website, so things that were licensed for copyright for reuse. So that made it inherently more difficult to find images. And again, these were the prototypes, but during the time I was doing the project, I hadn't considered mixed teams, and I think that would be something really, really interesting to do. So that would certainly be something to look into, because I do know with respect to ice hockey, let's say, before kids were about 13, 14, a lot of the teams are in fact mixed. So that would certainly be something to look at in terms of how that would influence some of the factors I talked about, like with self-efficacy, motivation, and those sorts of factors. But yeah, that would be really interesting.
Becky? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a bit of a sort of open question, but I'm just curious to know whether you know anything about why is that women tend to be pushed towards more individual sports. Is that the case? Like, I'm curious because it makes me one of the rationales for sport reminiscence for men with dementia is the fact that men typically are said to be very difficult to join groups, and women are somehow assumed to just find groups really easy, and yet in sport it seems to be that men are pushed towards team sports and women towards individual, but that may be completely wrong. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that?
I hadn't come across anything specific, but just in terms of what I know about, sport and exercise psychology and what motivates different individuals to pursue different sports, I think often, and as a result of the stereotyping, men and boys are kind of socialized into these group sports to kind of demonstrate, ability and seek out competition, where those sorts of, I guess, values aren't as heavily influenced or imposed upon girls. And I know in some of the research that I found for this, with respect to the 1996 gymnastics team, there was a media analysis of Sports Illustrated articles, and, it wasn't really focusing on their ability. It was about like their grace and their poise. So I think it just has to do with, how and why these individuals are socialized into the sports in the way that they are, and what's valued and what skills that get demonstrated are kind of valued over others. You're on mute, Andy.
I don't know why that's happening. I keep muting myself. Any other questions? I have one more for Becky. If no, okay. All right. So with your presentation, you mentioned that it was very new. So like I haven't read anything on this topic, so it was very illuminating for me. And I particularly was struck by the part in your presentation when you discuss, I forget the name of the participant that you used, but it was with the wife and child blaming sport for the husband and father's dementia. And I was wondering if you could speak to the reaction of the husband to his wife's and child's views on this. Like, was it confrontational? Did they keep it to themselves? Did he, maybe the fact that he had dementia, like that became impossible to discuss between them? I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that scenario.
Yeah, sure. So he's not aware that that's how they feel, in part because of the stage of his dementia that he's at. He's got quite advanced dementia. I think it's a real testament to their character, actually, that they go to a sort of huge lengths to still do a lot of football related activities with him. So looking at pictures in books, playing sort of theme tunes to the popular sports shows from the UK, playing around with mini footballs and things like that. It is something that's I've not come across at all in research yet. And in part, that's probably because it's only been in the last sort of 18 months that the Football Association in the UK has actually acknowledged that, yes, there is a link between heading football, sorry, I should call it soccer ball, and dementia. So it's not really something that's come up, but it was something that was really, I think it's something that really needs to be talked about, because there is certainly seems to be a bit of a pressure on people to celebrate the very kind of characteristics that's likely contributed to, him putting his head on the end of a boot and it getting repeated concussions and things like that. So it's something I think we need to start talking about and really considering in the research. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So if there's no more questions, we can end it there. That's all I had. I just want to thank both Allison and Becky for joining us today, and for the other two for joining us as participants. And just thank you. That was a really interesting discussion there. And just a quick note that our distinguished speaker today, Melissa Otterbein, and her co-presenters will be presenting live via Zoom at 1 p.m. Eastern Time in Toronto. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you. Cheers.
All right. We'll see you at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.